to combat and fight back with maltracks. The war of the minds, they want control of the masses. And Common Core, they dumb us down in the classes. Without knowledge, we can't gain access. Build with the elders, take notes and write classes. We keep whining on the block, how it's gonna stop? Let's start supporting our own, make their supply drop. We buy stocks, then we buy blocks. Cause we know the truth and we tuned in to Dr. Maat.
Peace and love, family. Welcome to another Truth to Power Talk with your sister, Dr. Maat. Thank you for joining another powerful discussion. And tonight, I have with me another powerful guest, Miss Kirsten Mullen. How are you doing tonight?
I am very well, thank you. Happy to be with you.
It's a pleasure. It's an honor to have you on the platform. Family, before we get started tonight, take a moment to thumb up this video. Thumb up this video. And after you thumb up this video, be sure to share this video on all social media platforms. And trust me, I'm going to be doing the same thing. I'm getting ready to start a watch party in one of my favorite Facebook groups called Black Sheep. So family, share this video on all of your social media platforms. Okay, let's get the viewership up. Also, if you have not subscribed to my channel, be sure to head on over to YouTube. For some of you are watching on Facebook and on other platforms, head on over to YouTube and subscribe to my channel, Dr. Maat. Be sure to hit the notification bell so that as soon as I go live, you will be notified. Also, family, there are people who've been inboxing me, Doc, I missed this discussion. I need to catch up. Family, I've created on my YouTube channel a Truth to Power Talk playlist. Okay, so if you've missed any of the discussions that I've had, and I brought on some powerful people. This last week, I brought on Brother Off West. The week before that, I brought on Nana Kwabanad Brown. I've brought on Dr. Gina Page, Dr. Rick Kittles. I've brought on a lot of powerful folks, the Barudis, Mama Barudi and Baba Barudi. So family, go back into the archives and check out those discussions. All right, check out those discussions. So tonight, family, we will be talking about reparations. We're going to focus on the book From Here to Equality. All right, reparations for Black Americans in the 21st century. So we're going to be talking about this book that was recently published by Dr. William A. Darity and Miss A. Kirsten Mullen. And just a couple of weeks ago, I believe I had Dr. Darity on sometime in September, October. He was on the show. And tonight I have with me his co-author of the book, Miss Kirsten Mullen. So Miss Kirsten, thank you so much again for being with me tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to be with you and your community.
Yes, ma'am. So family, I'm going to play. And let me get everything situated here. I'm going to read her audio and just play a little bit of music, just a little bit of music. All right. So here we go. Miss A. Kirsten Mullen is a folklorist and the founder of Artifactual, an arts consulting practice in Carolina Circuit Writers, a literacy consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She was a member of the Freelon Ajaje, I might be butchering this word, bond concept development team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institute's commission to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Under the auspices of the North Carolina Arts Council, she worked to expand the Coastal Folklife Survey. As a faculty member with the Community Folklife Documentation Institute, she trained students to research and record the state's African-American music heritage. Kirsten was a consultant on the North Carolina Museum of History's North Carolina Legends and Civil Rights exhibition projects. Her writing in museum catalogs, journals, and commercial media includes Black Culture of History Matters, The American Prospect, which examines the politics of funding Black cultural institutions. She and William A. Darity Jr. are the authors of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Family, if you do not have this book, be sure to get this book if you don't have it. And I'm going to share it again. I'm going to show it again. Be sure to get this book. Okay, be sure to get this book. If you're talking about reparations and you want to learn more about reparations, be sure, family, to invest in this book. All right. And you see that Dr. Maat has it. So I never ask you all to get something that I don't get myself. Ashe? All right. So Miss Kirsten, so tonight's topic, and I know a lot of folks are looking forward to this. I titled it Biden Leaves Out Reparations in His Racial Equity Plan. All right. And so, family, let me share my screen. Let me share my screen with you. And I want to pull up an article. I'm not going to read the article, but I am going to show you the article that was published by Newsweek. So this came across my feed. All right, share screen. Okay, so Ms. Mullen, can you see the Newsweek article? U.S. Yes. Biden leaves. Yeah. So I was, I looked at this article and I definitely read it. It says Biden leaves reparations out of racial equity plan, despite left's call for reform. And family, I'm going to drop this article. Matter of fact, let me copy it now. I'm going to drop it in the chat. Take a look at it and read it when you can, when you get an opportunity. All right. So I said I wasn't going to read it, but I do want to at least read the first couple of lines. OK, Democratic nominee Joe Biden's economic plan to combat racial inequality in the U.S. skips any mention of reparations, a concept gaining popularity in the mainstream despite past assurances that he would at least study the issue. The Build Back Better by Advancing Racial Equity across the American economy plan features investing in affordable housing and home ownership, bolstering small business opportunities, and making public schools as well as private historically Black school tuition free for families with incomes under $125,000. So it says, while the plan was notable in terms of addressing racial wealth barriers, it also was notable for leaving out bold ideas endorsed by the Black Lives Matter advocates in left wing of the party. It didn't include any form of direct financial compensation for Black Americans for enslavement and discriminatory policies. It also didn't address H.R. 40, a bill introduced in the House of Representatives that would study what the federal government owes the descendants of slaves and explore ways to repay the debt. All right. And so you saw that, family. And again, I'm going to drop the link in the chat. So be sure to check it out when you get an opportunity. So, Ms. Mullen, I want to ask you this. Should we have an issue with that? And this is not the bite, to pound on Joe Biden or anything like that. But should Black Americans have an issue with a plan that is supposed to address racial equity, okay, or inequality, but does not contain reparations? What are your thoughts on that, Mrs. Mullen?
Well, I would say that not only, Black Americans, but certainly especially Black Americans, but all Americans should be concerned that the president-elect is not talking about reparations program. This is something that is over 155 years overdue. And, it's interesting, when Biden was on the campaign trail and was asked about reparations, he allowed that it was something he would consider. Now, he wasn't specific at all about what he meant by reparations. Was he talking about, eliminating the racial wealth gap? We don't really know, what he meant, how far, what he would constitute as a reparations program. But he did say that this was something that he thought was positive and should happen. So I don't know, if this is an abrupt change, or if this is actually more of an illumination of what he meant, what he intended when he was on the reparations trail, on the campaign trail. But I think all Americans should be concerned about the debt that the United States government owes to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, and I'm just listening to you. I'm thinking about, because I watched a lot of videos, when he was on the campaign trail, and he did say that he would look at it. He didn't make any promises. But he did say that he would look at it, and he got in office and he said, look, I'm not including it, and so, and so here we are. But let's talk about reparations, because a lot of people, I don't think they understand exactly what it is and what Black Americans are owed. So I would like to first talk about reparations and then get into why you feel, and why many of us feel, that reparations are owed to Black Americans. So let's begin just with the definition of it.
Happily, yes. So for us, the case that we make From Here to Equality, that William Darity and I make, is that reparations is a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. Right? And so where Black people are concerned, where Black Americans are concerned, the grievous injustices that make the case for reparation, there are three things, basically. There's slavery, legal segregation or American apartheid, and ongoing discrimination and stigmatization. So, the acronym that we created is, that we use is ARC, A-R-C. So that's acknowledgement, redress, and closure. And these characterize these sort of three essential elements of the reparations program that we're advocating. So acknowledgement, redress, and closure. These are the basic components, right? These are the building blocks of the reparations project. So acknowledgement basically involves the recognition and admission of the wrong by the perpetrators or the beneficiaries of the injustice. For African Americans, this means the receipt of a formal apology and a commitment for redress on the part of the American people as a whole. So again, we're not talking about any specific person, not even, the president per se, but the American people as a whole. A national act of declaration that a great wrong has been committed, right? So, but beyond an apology, acknowledgement requires those who benefited from the exercise of these atrocities to recognize the advantages that they gained and commit themselves to the cause of redress. And so those gains could be monetary, they could be status. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that there are all kinds of ways that individuals, and we're talking here about, white Americans, the gains that they received as a consequence of enslavement of Black people. So redress potentially can take two forms, right? Not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? So there's restitution and then there's atonement. Restitution is the restoration of the survivors to the condition before the injustice occurred, or to a condition they might have attained had the injustice not taken place at all. So, of course, this is impossible to restore, those who were enslaved for a condition preceding their enslavement, not only because, the people who were enslaved are now deceased, their immediate offspring are also deceased. Actually, that's not entirely true. We do know, we tell the story in From Here to Equality of one person. We have known of at least four who is living today, who is the child of someone who was born enslaved. And that's Hortense McClinton, who's 102 years old and doing very well. She's in Maryland. But for the most part, that initial, that next generation has died away. But many thousands of people were born into slavery. So we can't make those people whole. But it is possible to move their descendants toward a more equitable position, commensurate with the status they would have attained in the absence of those injustices. So, there are a number of forms that atonement can take, as an alternative form of redress. But basically, it occurs when the perpetrators or the beneficiaries meet the conditions of forgiveness that are acceptable to the victims. Mm-hmm. So, achieving these elements of reparations program requires good faith negotiations between the wronged and the wrongdoers. We don't really have a mechanism for establishing when African Americans collectively will have reached an agreement that sufficient steps have been taken to justify forgiveness. So consequently, atonement is really difficult to accomplish. This is why in our in our work, we treat restitution as the appropriate form of redress. And we have clear metrics for determining when restitution has been achieved that we don't have for establishing something like atonement. Atonement is much more kind of a philosophical thing. I mean, it's an individual thing, but restitution is something that can be concrete. So specifically, when you're talking about African Americans, restitution would eliminate the racial disparities in wealth, in income, education, health, sentencing and incarceration, political participation, and subsequent opportunities to engage in American political and social life. It would require not only an endeavor to compensate for past repression and exploitation, but also an endeavor to offer sort of stubborn existing obstacles to full Black participation in American political and social life. So, we're talking about, a measure that would dramatically improve the position of Black people in this country that are associated with sharp and enduring reductions in these racial disparities, especially the economic disparities, like the racial wealth gap, and then sort of the corresponding sharp and enduring improvements in Black well-being. And then the last piece is closure, right? That's the C in ARC. So closure involves this sort of mutual reconciliation between African Americans and the beneficiaries of slavery, of legal segregation, and ongoing discrimination toward Blacks. So in this instance, whites and Blacks would come to terms over the past, confront the present, and then work together to create this new United States of America. And then, and only then, after this reparations program is executed and racial inequality is eliminated, Black Americans would then have no further claims for race-specific policies on their behalf from the American government, on the assumption that no new specific injustices are afflicted upon them, right? So, this is what we're thinking about when we talk about reparations.
Hold on, Miss Mullen. I got to drop a bomb for you. And tell me the acronym again, Mrs. Mullen, that's in the book.
So it says ARC, A-R-C.
A-R-C, ARC. And see, when I was listening to you, I was listening carefully. And your acronym eliminates, so actually destroys the idea that we've received reparations. I've heard white and Black people say that Obama was our reparations. So people have said that. In fact, there was an article that just dropped on theblaze.com, and I want to share my screen with you just so you can see. Okay, she's not making this up over here. Let me show you this article right here, Mrs. Mullen. So there was an article that dropped on December the 8th, and it says Michael Eric Dyson says Joe Biden paid the debt owed to Black Americans by picking a Black man for Secretary of Defense. And so what you're saying to me is that that's not true. There was no debt owed. Like, there was no debt paid. Not that there was no debt owed, but there was no debt paid to Black Americans. I believe that there's some folks who said Obama apologized while he was in office, regarding that. But we haven't received any form of reparations. And so, having Obama as a president is not reparations. Biden electing a Black person as a Secretary of Defense, that's not reparations. When we think of reparations, like you said, we're thinking of race-specific policies that will benefit us, that will close the racial wealth gap. And so, I'm glad that I love the acronym that you put together, because it dispels those ideas that the debt has been paid. Now, I want to ask you this: what atrocities have been committed that they owe us reparations for? So we know slavery. So people go back, it's slavery. But what I want folks to understand that it was much more than slavery. We were systematically locked out of wealth. And anytime we tried to build wealth, Mrs. Mullen, they came in and destroyed us. And so some people say, oh, well, it's Tulsa, but it wasn't just Tulsa. It was Wilmington, Delaware. It was Elaine. It was Rosewood. And so, Miss Mullen, I want you to walk us back in time, from slavery and until present day, and show us why are we, and explain to the viewers, why do they owe us reparations?
So before, and I absolutely wanted to do exactly what you asked, but I wanted to say something about Eric Dyson's, Michael Eric Dyson's comment.
Okay.
The kinds of changes that we're seeing, the kinds of programs, the appointments that Biden and his team are advocating are good things, right? And we want to applaud them, but they are not reparations. They're not the same thing. And so, our hope would be that we see the Biden administration embracing the concept of both and, right? So, yes, the measures that they are putting forth, where they are, seeking, Black thought leaders, Black scholars, Black professionals who have not just the status quo in mind, but remedies that are going to make the quality of life better for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, and also a program of reparations. So Absolutely. Both and is what we would advocate. That's what we would wish for. Okay. So you asked me about the history. So, when we base the case for reparations on an event or a series of events that happened at the end of the Civil War. So this is a period when the newly emancipated enslaved people were promised 40-acre land grants. So this is something that, many of us are familiar with the phrase 40 acres and a mule.
Yes.
And this refers to, General Sherman's Special Orders, Field Orders 15, in which, Black Americans were promised 40-acre land grants. And the idea was that the land would be made available to them at a reasonable price that they could eventually purchase outright. And in the meantime, they could develop the foodstuffs or the other crops, cotton, frequently tobacco, on those properties, and sell them to the government at a fixed price. So this would be the first such case when large numbers of Black Americans were able to engage in contracts with anyone, let alone the federal government, and receive a market price for their products. But Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Andrew Johnson ascends to the presidency, and he decides that no, this is not going to happen. We're talking about an incredibly large amount of land that would have been available to those Black folks. You're talking about basically a strip of land from the Sea Islands of South Carolina all the way to Florida, a 30-mile band of land. This would have been a tremendous boost to the lives and the livelihoods of these individuals. This would have given them a grub stake. They would have been property owners. They would be allowed to vote. But most importantly, they would have had land that they could develop and pass on to their progeny. So at the same time, 1862, we have the Homestead Acts, which are very little talked about. I mean, I can remember studying this in grade school, but not really understanding the significance of the Homestead Acts.
Yes.
And I certainly don't recall any history teacher presenting the Homestead Acts to me alongside the failed promise of 40 acres and a mule. So at the same time that, Black people were denied these 40-acre land grants per household, white Americans, including new immigrants to the United States, were given 160-acre land grants in the western part of the U.S. This was part of the completing the sort of colonial project in the United States. These are lands that were just very recently occupied by, indigenous people. And, again, this is land that you could farm it, you could subdivide it, you could lease it. If there were minerals or oil on the land, it was yours. The land was tax-free. If you improved the land, which is say if you built a house on it, it was yours outright, or you could occupy the land for 6 months and pay the government $1.25 an acre and become the owner. But we now know that this is the grub stake, this free equity, as Neil Kashkari, who is the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, he calls it free equity. This we now know is the beginning of the racial wealth gap, because white Americans, including new immigrants, had this 160-acre land grants that they could pass down to their offspring. And we know that the intergenerational cumulative effects of being able to transfer either the land itself or the profits from it, this is how wealth is made. This is how wealth is built. So you've got white Americans who have these land grants that they can pass on to their children, and then you have Black people who have nothing. Right? And so bringing that forward, but the fact of this, this disparity that the federal government created in the 1860s, and the land grant, the Homestead Acts program was in place until the 1940s. We're talking some 287 million acres of land total, according to the U.S. Department of Interior. So to give your listeners some idea of what that looks like, 287 million acres of land is the equivalent of all of Washington State, Oregon, California, Nevada, and Massachusetts, or all of California and all of Texas combined. That's the amount of land we're talking about. We know that something like 1.5 million families received those land grants, white families, and that today that translates to something like 45 million individuals, who is like a quarter of the current American population that's over the age of 24, is still reaping the benefits of that single federal government program. So you've got, Black Americans on the one hand who were promised and denied 40-acre land grants, right? And this was, land that had been abandoned by the Confederate rebels or confiscated from them by the federal government, and 160-acre land grants that were made available to white Americans. So, so this is where the wealth gap starts. And the sort of intergenerational building, its buildup, is what brings us today to a situation where we know that on average, Black American households' wealth position is $850,000 less than that of white households. So in order to eliminate this racial wealth gap, in order to bring Black American descendants of U.S. slavery up to the same, advantage point of whites. So we're talking, Black people are 13% of the population in the United States, but only represent 2.5% of the nation's wealth. So if you're going to bring that 13% of the American population, which is Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, bring them up to the same position as these white households, you would need a federal outlay of between $10 to $12 trillion. And that is basically what it would cost. This is the commitment they were hoping, that the current administration will seek.
When you say they were hoping, what do you mean?
I'm saying I think this is, the hope was, well, so it's completely unlikely that, if Donald Trump had won the election, it's very unlikely that he would have advocated for a reparations program. The leadership in the Senate and the president are both on the record as opposing reparations.
Yes.
Right. So the hope was that if a Democrat or, a third party candidate potentially won the election, that there might be a much more significant likelihood that a reparations program could be put in place.
Mm-hmm. And so I definitely want to plus one what you said regarding, you said slavery, you talked about the Homestead Act, the different land grants. I read that a lot of the land that the white folks were able to get, they said some of them had oil on it. And so those white folks became, billionaires overnight. And during that time, even the land that some of us were able to get, it was snatched from us. We were denied loans.
Right.
I'm sitting here thinking about the convict leasing program, Jim Crow. So we were systematically locked out of wealth. And as I stated, earlier, when we tried to build something for ourselves, it was just destroyed. When we had these business districts set up where we were circulating our dollars and exchanging our dollars with one another, they came and destroyed that. And speaking of which, Ms. Mullen, so is it possible, some fat Black folks are saying, look, they're not going to give us reparations. And so we need to start focusing on reparations. And what we need to do is start circulating the Black dollar in the Black community, just like the Jews and just like the Asians. Do you think that would help to advance the Black community economically and politically if we begin to circulate our dollars, Ms. Mullen, or do you still think that reparations is necessary?
I think Black people are already circulating their dollars in the Black community. It's important to know, though, that the Black community, especially the Black business community, has taken a real hit in the pandemic. 41% of Black businesses have closed since the pandemic started. We know that over the last 9 years, the total number of Black-owned banks has been reduced by half. There's not enough money in the Black community to turn this around.
No.
We don't have it. All of our best intentions are not. If that were the case, it would have already been done.
Exactly.
You need a redistribution of wealth. And once that happens, then Black people could choose to invest in Black businesses. But you need to have something to invest with. Black businesses are historically undercapitalized. Only 4% of Black businesses have more than one employee. 4%. Walmart has more profit than all of the Black businesses in the U.S. combined. It's a very, we have this notion that, we can do this ourselves and,
yes,
pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you would just save more money, work harder. I think about the working class community that I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, where many of the families, including my mother, had 2 or 3 jobs my entire life. These were incredibly hardworking people. They were persevering, they were smart, but the jobs that were available to them were low-wage jobs.
Yeah, exactly.
And no matter how hard they worked, how long, how many hours, they were never going to have wealth. It just wasn't possible.
It wasn't possible. I agree 100% with you.
Yeah, and it still isn't. The unemployment in the Black community is 2.5 times that of what it is in the white community, and has been, for as long as it's been measured. It's almost as if there's a little group in a back room that says, "Oh wait, the percentage is getting off a little bit. We have to do something, make some changes so that it stays the same." This is not a figment of people's imagination. When you look at things like, I was just reading through some early chapters of our book earlier this evening, when the Civil War was underway. And finally, the U.S. government decided that it would actively recruit, the contraband, as they were called. These were, Black people who had liberated themselves from the plantations and from the houses of the folks who owned them and made their way to Union lines. And the federal government is trying to determine, what are they going to pay these people? And Abraham Lincoln and others were concerned that whites would not accept, a plan where the black, army, the soldiers, the Navy folks received the same pay as whites. And so they ended up doing something like, and I may have these figures a little bit off, but I want to say that let's say the black soldiers were paid $10 a month, but $3 were deducted to pay for their uniforms, both to purchase them and to launder them every month. So basically they're getting $7. Mm-hmm. And then the whites in the military receive $10 and they get a $3 allowance to help pay for their rations and their laundering. So they're getting $13 and the blacks are getting $7. So from the very beginning, you've got this disparity baked in. And frequently the black soldiers got paid late or not at all. Mm-hmm. And they spent, months and years in some cases, they and their family members trying to get the federal government to pay what was owed. This kind of mindset that black people don't deserve, that black lives are not worth what white lives are worth. Now, it's interesting. For 400 years, black people were the labor force that made the whole country work. But suddenly, when they're paid workers, their value
decreases.
It decreases.
Yeah, that's what I said. Decreases.
Oh, decreases. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I didn't understand you, but yes, yeah. I mean, they're incredibly valuable. I think I've said, almost jokingly, black lives have not mattered since slavery ended.
Hold on, Dad. Hold on, Ms. Mullen.
In some ways.
Woo!
I mean, it's a sad commentary. But
yeah, it was just like, you said it hasn't mattered since slavery. I just want to salute Baba Siba. He's in the building. Baba is in the building. I see you, Baba. He said this is extremely informative. Thank you so much, Baba, for tuning in. Peace to the family. I see you all are trickling in. You all are trickling in tonight, family. I have with me Miss Kirsten Mullen, author of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Baba, I know you just joined us. And so we talked about Biden and how Biden left out reparations in his racial equity plan. We addressed Michael Dyson's comment about Black people. The debt to Black Americans have been paid since Biden elected a Black Secretary of Defense. And so, yeah, Baba, we've been getting it in. So salute to you, Baba. Thank you so much for joining the show. So, Mrs. Mullen, I'm glad that you brought that up. A lot of people don't understand the amount of wealth that was generated during, slavery and Jim Crow. And so you even hear white Americans say, well, why should I have to pay reparations and my taxes go up? I don't benefit. I didn't benefit, from the slave labor. Those are my ancestors. They benefited. I'm not benefiting. But, if you study the legacy, or not even the legacy, I'm sorry, if you study the history of a lot of these companies, Wells Fargo, for example, JP Morgan, it's a lot of them, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, even Georgetown University, they say, hey, we were able to build our institutions from slavery. Some of them, even I think it's called New York MetLife is an insurance company in New York. And they also said, yeah, we got we built our institutions, from slavery. Even Wall Street, they say, well, we built out, our institution from slavery. And so it just amazes me, Mrs. Mullen, that a lot of people feel like, or a lot of, the whites in particular feel like, well, it's not me, it was my ancestors. We don't benefit. And a lot of these institutions who benefited from slavery still stand today. So what do you have to say to that, Miss Mullen, to those people who say, we no longer, slavery, Jim Crow, that's the past, Miss Mullen, that's the past. And we no longer benefit from that stuff. It just happened in the past. What do you say to those people, Miss Mullen?
So, I think one thing I would say is that, we don't really know our history. We have these notions of what we imagine is our history, but we really haven't studied it. It's interesting. We met with a history class, 2 history classes at a local virtual meeting with 2 history classes, high school students. And they actually had read our book. I think it's like 54 students. It's quite amazing to have a
that's beautiful.
And one of the assignments I believe that their teacher had given them was to talk to their parents and grandparents about how they saw themselves in terms of their wealth position and how did they acquire it. And it's fascinating to hear the students, sharing what they learned from their families. Many of them grew up in families where there was a lot of conversation about, meritocracy and how hard they worked, and that they were self-made in some cases. And certainly, I'm absolutely certain these individuals did work incredibly hard. But in the case of the white families, they also had the benefit of the support of the community. They didn't have, individuals or institutions actively getting in their way, actively preventing them from doing well. A couple of the students were recent immigrants, or they're in families that were recent immigrants to the U.S. And, we always say, when you migrate to a country, you migrate to its history and to its obligations.
Hold on, wait a minute, Ms. Mullen. Say that again. When you migrate to a country, say that again.
You migrate to its history and to its obligations. And it's very clear to us that, a big part of what these immigrants are attracted to, Black and white, when they come to the United States, is this infrastructure, is the businesses, is the education, all these institutions, the business enterprise that were made possible because this country began with 400 years. The nation began with 400 years of enslaved labor. And so, this is what America is. This is how the country was formed. We didn't have to begin as a slave nation, but we did. The Republic could have said, we'll never have slavery here. This is going to be a place, we're declaring our independence from England, and we will never legalize slavery. But that's not what they did. That's not what our forefathers did. They said, we're liberating ourselves from England, and we will be a slave state. We will be a slave nation. And so everything proceeds from that. People could say, well, it would have been a great country regardless. We had all these amazing minds and innovators, and, folks had all kinds of interesting ideas, and they were, they were dedicated. Yes, but we can't prove the counterfactual, right? The fact is, enslaved Black people were the folks who developed this country.
Hold on one sec, Ms. Mullen. So Ms. Mullen, when we say we built this country, it's not just to feel good. When you say, well, we built this country, this is a fact. This is a fact. People say, oh, the Black people over there keep talking about they built this country. This is a fact. We built this country. Even I'm a native of Baltimore, and I was studying the history of Baltimore. We built Baltimore. We built Maryland, and so, they started importing us here in Maryland. I believe it was in 1675. And so we built Baltimore. We built Maryland. So when Black folks say that we built this country, these are facts. And so it kills me with the stereotype that Black folks are lazy, Ms. Mullen. When I study the history of our people and I hear the stereotype, oh, Black folks are lazy, they don't want to do. We the hardest working people on the planet, Ms. Mullen. We the hardest working folks on the planet. And they talking about, well, we lazy. And so Anyway, Miss Mullen, I know that I only have about 15 minutes left with you. I want to get into the book From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. I see that the book is broken into, I believe it's 7 parts. Let me flip open the content. 6 parts. 6 parts. And so I love in part 1 how you all talk about the political history of America's reparations movement. Because a lot of people aren't aware that they think that the HR 40 hearing that took place, I believe it was the beginning of this year or last year. They think that
June 2019.
June 2019. So that was last year. And so a lot of people think that, it was that is something new that Black people have proposed because it was on C-SPAN. A lot of us were watching it on C-SPAN and YouTube. And so they think that the reparations movement is something new, when in fact it's been a push for reparations. I mean, going back to post-slavery, it's been a push for reparations. And so I see that you began there and then you ended part 2 with the myths of racial equality. And so, Miss Mullen, I love that. I think that you guys are laying a strong foundation in chapter 1, because with the myths of racial equality, because people think that we are under they say the illusion of inclusion, and Black folks think that we have arrived because some of us, we're educated, we have PhDs, master's degrees, bachelor's degrees. Some of us have, 6-figure jobs. And so we believe some folks are looking like, what do you mean? We're fighting for equality. We have racial equality. What are you saying? I actually have a buddy of mine. I got into he and I had a friendly debate because he's, he makes over $200,000. So he's like, what are you talking about? All this Black empowerment stuff. He's like, I have my degree from Hopkins. I'm making $200K. I'm living in this $800,000 house. So he's like, I live better than most white Americans. So he's like, what are you talking about? And so I had to give him the numbers and show him that's you. That's, we call that Black exceptionalism. That's you. But collectively, all Black people, I think they said, I think 48% of us live at or below the poverty line, Ms. Mullen. I don't know if you can correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct.
Yeah, so about 48% of us live at or below the poverty line. So you made it out, but a lot of us haven't, And so I love in part 1 how you tap into that. And then in part 2, who reaped the fruits of slavery? Who reaped the fruits of slavery. Now, I got a question for you. The end of part 2, you say roads not taken in the early years of the Republic. Could you kind of touch on that for me, Ms. Mullen?
So, yes, we were surprised to learn, first of all, how strong the anti-slavery movement was in the South. This is certainly something that I didn't learn in school, but Black people were the first abolitionists. I think from the minute that, Black folks who had been captured, shackled, enslaved, and sold here, the minute they were able to get away, they tried. They were actively liberating themselves. They were the first abolitionists. So that's, I think, a very important point. We don't talk about that so much. We talk a little bit about Frederick Douglass, but we don't really talk so much about, these Black people who were actively engaged in liberation for themselves and for other Black people. But I was surprised to learn that, prior to the 1830s, there were over 100 anti-slavery organizations in the South. And in fact, there were more such organizations in the South than in the North. But as, tensions rose, those individuals were ostracized. They were threatened. Some of them threatened with bodily harm and worse. And many of them, were actively silenced, or they moved north. And so it became increasingly more difficult for one to be outspoken about the horrors of slavery. What was much more acceptable was this kind of romanticization of slavery, romanticization of, very interesting. This is even earlier than the period we're talking about now, but very in the 1700s, there was a major slave insurrection in New York City, and one of the judges was, saying, I don't really understand what's going on. We have rescued these people. We take good care of them. We clothe them. They're in better condition than the poor people in other countries of the world. We're civilizing these these savages. Why aren't they happy? So there's a lot of so on the one hand, you have this fiction that everything was hunky dory and that these Black people were just enthralled. I mean, they were just their greatest hope and wish was to serve white people 24/7. But if that was the reality, why do we have all these draconian laws policing Black people's movements, policing their ability to gather and talk among themselves about the politics of the day? Why do you have the Fugitive Slave Act? So it's like, there's a disconnect. If all of these Black people were just thrilled with their lives, then why do you have this incredible mechanism and all of these laws to punish them? If they think otherwise, if they should deign to want to have a different kind of life. So there was always a propaganda campaign in place. Mm-hmm. There was always an effort to suppress evidence of insurrection, of insubordination, of successful slave runaways. That was always happening. And then there was always, efforts on the part of whites to learn from whites in other places about what was happening with the enslaved people that you all, own. What are the early signs of problems among the enslaved so that we can be on the lookout and can nip them in the bud, before they develop into full-blown insurrections. I coined the term dismemory to characterize the systematic and organized efforts of groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the American Daughters of the Revolution to have textbooks, for grade school students written that portrayed this fictionalized version of American history. This, this notion that slavery was this benign institution that was civilizing, that, gave Black people purpose in life. And that, the Southerners were just fighting for their honor. And they just, they had this, this humanity that was so essential that, they needed all of these other people to support and protect them. I wanted to, I don't know if I have time to read you really quick. I was looking at the work of, you mentioned the Roads Not Taken. And yes. We write about a woman, her name is Stone. Let me find it real quick here. And she was a young woman during Catherine Stone. She's a young woman during the period of the Civil War. And here she is. This is page 84. She's in Mississippi native. So we're fortunate to have the letters and the journals of many of these Southerners where they were much more candid about what was really happening on the ground. And it's a very different view than what you would see in the newspapers, because the newspapers were actively, as they do today, controlling the message. And so let's see here. So in 1861, she's 20 years old, and she's writing about their 1,260 acre cotton plantation called Broken Burn, and the 150 Black laborers that they enslaved. So she talks about this idyllic and hopeful time before the lives of her family members were interrupted by the, quote, white heat of war. She writes, the Negroes seemed as much ours as the land they lived on. The crop of 1861 would pay off all indebtedness, leaving a surplus, and hereafter we would have nothing to do but enjoy ourselves. So this young woman had 5 brothers, right? And so these 150 Black people were supporting all of them. And so because of their efforts, so you're asking, was this really a lucrative, profitable enterprise? Absolutely. Because of these Black people's enterprise, she and her family could look forward to, as she says, doing nothing but enjoying ourselves. So she and her 5 brothers were looking forward to her first trip abroad in the summer of 1862, a grand tour of Europe, an indulgence that had become fashionable with the Southern elite. but it was canceled because of the tumult of the war. 2 of her brothers would die in service to the Confederacy. So years later, so 1900, she's now living in Tallulah, Louisiana, and she's married, and she has a somewhat different impression. She's thinking very differently of those days. When she and her family forced, at least 150 Black men, women, and children, to do their bidding at Broken Burn. So she writes in 1900, even under the best owners, it was a hard, hard life to toil 6 days out of 7, week after week, month after month, year after year, as long as life lasted, to be absolutely under the control of someone until the last breath was drawn, to win but the bare necessities of life, no hope of more, no matter how hard the work, how long the toil, and to know nothing could change your lot. Obedience, revolt, submission, prayers, all were in vain. Waking sometimes in the night as I grew older and thinking it all over, I would grow sick with the misery of it all. And then we write, nevertheless, in 1902, she helped establish the Madison Infantry Chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and was influential in the erection of a Confederate memorial in Tallulah. So clearly these people knew what the reality was, but they were invested in creating a different reality for their, for their offspring and for the generations to come. I think it's important for us to understand that it's not a mistake. It's not an accident that so many of us, were in schools that use these textbooks, because the United Daughters of the Confederacy, blackballed authors who had accurate textbooks. They went to education conferences, identified those individuals. They tried to convince them to change the narratives. And when they were not successful, they hired their own writers. In some cases, they wrote textbooks themselves. We often wonder, if, these white Confederate women were so angry that their men didn't win the war, the physical war, that they said, well, we're going to win the war of the mind.
That's right.
We're going to pick up where they left off. And in some ways, the work that they have done has been as damaging.
That's right.
As the war itself. It has certainly been long lasting, and it has been tremendously difficult to counter it, with facts. And we have all kinds of media that support it. So they were working with texts, with books, but then you have Hollywood.
Come on, talk about it.
And brings us films. People talk about just how mesmerizing those early movies were, because they were novel and people had never seen anything like that before. The talkies, moving pictures. And, I certainly remember any number of films with incredibly perverse images of Black people, degraded images of Black people that were presented as history, in the school that I went to. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are students who were shown Birth of a Nation as history when it's actually fiction. There's a lot of problem, and we could talk about that. Be a whole show,
right? Exactly.
But I'm saying, these kinds of media have tremendous amount of power. In fact, they're probably more powerful than books in some ways, because they, they're hitting your senses, and and they exist today. People are trying to talk about, what do we do with these plantations? Do we still call them plantations? Do we take kids on field trips to see them? And what kind of messages do we want them to receive? What kind of lessons do we want them to impart? Or young women who want to have a wedding and dress up like Scarlett O'Hara at their wedding when they have go to these destination weddings to these plantation sites. And all of that, comes from books like Gone with the Wind. But seeing these movies, I know there's a lot of work to be done to reverse the indoctrination that we as a nation, and not just the U.S. We exported these films to the world. And I mean, I often will encounter, people from other countries whose impressions of Black Americans were received through films.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
If it was Black exploitation films, they're expecting, Black men to be, gangsters, to be outlaws, to be drug dealers, expecting, Black women only to be prostitutes or, dishonest in some way. The cinema is very, very powerful. So, finding, one of the things that we talk about, as a part of the reparations project would be 3 generations minimum of curriculum changes, accurate curriculum being taught in the public schools, so that we don't find ourselves in the same position 100 years from now. Hopefully reparations will happen in our lifetime, and the history books will be, accurate portrayals of what actually has transpired in the United States.
Absolutely. Hold up, Ms. Mullen. I got to give this up for you. Woo! Oh my gosh, Ms. Mullen, you talked about indoctrination. You talked about imagery, the use of propaganda, miseducation, and these are things. And see, that's why books like Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery by dr.maat.msu is important. Books by Baba Olatunji and Baba Mku. They have a book called Raising Awareness. So books like this, books like From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. That's why books like this is very important. It's imperative that we have these books, and not only that we read them, Ms. Mullen, as you stated, that we teach this information to our babies. So, Ms. Mullen, I have a program called Meltrek. My family created a program called Meltrek. Mel is short for melanin. Trek means journey. So we're taking you on a journey to understand the history, culture, and achievements of melanated people. In this program, we target elementary and middle school children purposely. And we do that for a reason. Frederick Douglass said that it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So I said, I'm going after the babies. I love having conversation with adults. I teach at a university. Folks who follow me know I teach at Morgan State University. So I teach at a university, but my program is geared towards the young folks. It's geared towards the babies. And so we're teaching our babies about our history, our culture, and our achievements to combat the propaganda, to combat the miseducation. And another book that's good, family, is Take Back Mind Control by Babakidi Awadu. He has a book out called Mind Control, and he talks about the propaganda, and he gives us techniques to guard our minds, against a lot of this propaganda. So anyway, Ms. Mullen, I want to move on to chapter 3. It says alternatives to war and slavery, race and racism during the Civil War. What can we expect to get out of that particular part?
So, this is a section where we were, trying to identify opportunities when the United States could have both avoided a civil war and eliminated slavery. And one of the mechanisms that was available is something called compensated emancipation. And, this was a program in which slave owners would be paid, a market rate for their human chattel. There were any number of programs that were put forth. Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists had several programs. Abraham Lincoln, before he became president, had tried to get a program of compensated emancipation passed in Illinois, but he was unsuccessful. We only know of one case in the U.S. where this actually happened, and this was in the District of Columbia. It was it was 1862, where, if you were not, if you had not borne arms against the United States, you could receive, I believe it was $350 per human chattel that you owned. But Lincoln tried, before the war started, all through the war, he tried to convince Southerners, legislators, elected officials, to accept a program where the Southerners would not have to do without, capital. They needed, he recognized that they're not going to just, give up these enslaved people because they had invested so much money in them. We know now that in today's money, you would be paying about $380,000 for each of these individuals, right? But at the time, something between $300 to $700 was about the market rate. Now, to be clear, a number of these folks who were proponents of the compensated emancipation project wanted those newly freed Black people to be sent to the continent. They did not want large numbers of free Black people to be in the United States. They thought that was going to be a problem. So a lot of the proponents for compensated emancipation worked in tandem with the folks who were all about taking these folks out of the United States and sending them to the continent, in particular to Liberia. And in fact, there was at least one shipload of about 500 folks. So there were some Black people some enslaved Black people who their ship was attacked. Pirates captured them, but also about 50 to 80 or so free Blacks in the U.S. volunteered to go to Liberia. And that's an interesting story too, because what we know of that, about that group that landed in Liberia is that they turned around and oppressed the native Liberians in the same way that Black people had been oppressed here. But that's a conversation for another time. But throughout the war, Abraham Lincoln continued to meet with business people, to meet with legislators, to try to get them to accept compensated emancipation so that the war wouldn't have to be fought. They came very close in Delaware. So, Lincoln thought Delaware was a good potential case to try this because the number of enslaved Black people in Delaware was really very low. I want to say it was less than 5%. Also, the crops that were grown in Delaware were not of the same type as what was grown mostly across the South. So not tobacco, not cotton, not indigo, not rice. It was a much more variated crop base. And so he thought, well, Delaware is different enough from the South that perhaps they won't have the same kind of psychological or economic hold on slavery. And perhaps they'd be willing to emancipate the small number of enslaved Black people who are here. But that wasn't the case. They were one vote short. And so he didn't have this model of Delaware. But, so many lives could have been saved. The actual cost of the war was almost twice if you take into account what the North and the South spent on the war. It's actually about twice what it would have cost if all of the slaves, all people who were enslaved in the South had been bought and paid for by the federal government. But we feel pretty strongly that the South was convinced they were going to win the war, and they didn't see any there was no value in negotiating because they didn't. Their way of life was so important to them, and maintaining these human chattel that they simply weren't willing to even negotiate. To say, well, maybe $700 is too low, but that didn't even happen. They didn't come back with a counter offer. And all we can imagine is that they just were absolutely certain that they were going to win the war. So, they were just not really interested, not invested in trying to negotiate. But as recent as the Hampton Roads meeting that Lincoln had with Alexander Stephens, he was still pushing, this concept of compensated emancipation, but to no avail. He couldn't get any takers apart from, the folks who were in the District of Columbia.
Well, Ms. Mullen, I've read an article that stated that slave owners were compensated. I have to go back and look.
So there've been a few cases.
Okay.
But not large scale. So what I'm talking
Okay.
about is like during the Revolutionary War. If so initially the British said that they would grant freedom to anyone who fought on the British side. And so you had Black people enslaved and free who fought for the British. And they evacuated those people out of the US when they lost the war. So, a few of the folks who stayed, some of them were actually, unscrupulous white people sold them back into slavery. But eventually the Americans feared that, Black enslaved folks would go to the British side so that they could become emancipated. And so they said, all right, we will allow, enslaved Black people to fight for the American side. And they compensated their owners for those individuals.
Okay, so you said that was during the American Revolutions, and I just pulled it up, Ms. Mullen. I read this paper or this article that was published by the New York Times last year. It's entitled "When Slave Owners Got Reparations," and so it's an opinion paper. I want to be clear; it's an opinion paper published by the New York Times, and it said that Lincoln signed a bill in 1862 that paid up to $300 for every enslaved person free.
This is BC. This is the District of Columbia that I was talking about.
Oh, okay. So
it's about 3,000 people, about 3,000 enslaved people.
Yes. Okay.
That's the District of Columbia. That's the one incident.
Okay.
That it happened.
But you're saying that it wasn't it wasn't across the board, like through the South. Okay.
No.
Okay.
I mean, Lincoln thought, perfect. Now we've got we've got an example on the board. Let's try to see if we can get, all of the border states, to agree, but no.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. And you're right. It does say Washington, because I looked and I said, they got reparations. And so I
but reparations went to the slave owners,
right?
Not to the enslaved.
Not to the enslaved. Absolutely. It went to the owners. Absolutely. But and I just want to be clear, it was in Washington family. So when I read the article, it was specifically in Washington. It wasn't, like you said, throughout the South. Right. Okay, beautiful. And so in part 4, Rehearsals for Freedom, Radicals and Rebels, 7 Mystic Years. So what is the focus of part 4? Is it, you getting into the rebels, the Maroons, or what are we talking about in part 4, Ms. Mullen?
This is a part of the book that I really love. We don't talk much about Reconstruction. These 7 mystic years. And this was this very brief period when Blacks and whites co-governed. Now we're talking Black and white men, because women didn't have the right to vote. Right. But this is, a very important time in our history. Going back to the birth of a nation, for example, there are these really wretched scenes of Black legislators, who have their shoes off and their feet are up on the desks, and they're eating fried chicken and eating watermelon, basically disgracing the, these halls of government. But in fact, these coalitions of Black and white people gave us public education. We did not have public education in the South, even for white children, before Reconstruction.
Hold on, repeat that one more time, Ms. Mullen. I want to make sure I heard you right.
So during the period of Reconstruction across the South, Black and white legislators came together to create a system of public education for Black and white students. That did not exist certainly didn't exist for Black people, because Black people, were forbidden. It was illegal for them to be taught to read or write. But public education for white children did not exist before Reconstruction, and legislation that was jointly worked out by Black and white politicians.
Okay. Understood.
So not only that, but they worked to create equal expenditures for the school buildings. Now we're not talking about integrated schools. We're talking, separate schools. But for a brief period, they were equal. So the expenditures for the black schools and the white schools were the same. They were paying the same amount for teachers and for, the materials that the students received for this very brief period of time. Now, it's interesting, the longest stretch that we see of this cooperative governance model might be 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. And this is the date of an incredibly horrific white massacre.
Yes. Wilmington, Delaware, right?
North Carolina.
Oh, North Carolina. Okay.
North Carolina. Okay. It's I would like to know, we're trying to learn more about it. There is a historian in Wilmington named Kent Chatfield, who has done a lot of work on Wilmington, looking at land transfers that happened. So basically, at a certain point, the white elite decided that this coalition was just not working to their advantage. You had the radical Republicans working with white farmers, the populace, basically. They were seeing that they had common concerns, common complaints, and they were working companionably together. But it wasn't working for, all of, the white people in power. And so they decided that this needed to be disrupted. And it was disrupted with violence. We don't know how many black people were killed ultimately, but we do know that the black community was burned.
Yes.
The newspapers burned to the ground. The presses were destroyed. Black people fled for their lives. And, what had been a majority black city becomes a minority black city. The numbers of black people who were voting after the turn of the century drops by about 80%. It's a huge change. We know more about the Tulsa riot, but it's very unusual for, we're in North Carolina, but we had probably been here about 10 or 12 years before we knew anything about the Wilmington riots. It wasn't taught in schools.
No.
It just wasn't commonly known. And like Tulsa, there was a governmental commission that was pulled together to study what had happened. And, they have a lot of information and I think recommended, I know that they recommended that reparations be paid both in the case of Tulsa, the white riots in Tulsa and in Wilmington, but nothing has come of it in either case.
And Ms. Mullen, you're right. I stand corrected. It is Wilmington, North Carolina. I keep thinking of Wilmington, Delaware, because when I was in the service in 1998, our financial 374th Battalion was in Wilmington, Delaware. So every time I hear Wilmington, my mind goes back to the 374th Finance Battalion in Wilmington, Delaware. But you're right. It was Wilmington, North Carolina. And it's the massacre of 1898. I believe it happened on November the 11th, and there's a documentary called Wilmington on Fire.
Yes,
and it's on Amazon.
Christopher Everett. Christopher Everett is the director of that documentary. And he's working on a second film, actually, a follow-up.
Beautiful. I watched about an hour of it. I've been watching it in chunks with my 10-year-old. So we watched like 30 minutes. We talk about it. We watch another 30 minutes. So we're on the last 30 minutes. It's only 90 minutes.
Okay.
And so we're on that. So family, please be sure to check it out. It's on Amazon Prime Video.
It's a fabulous documentary.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love it so far. Part 5, I take it, sins of the sons and daughters beyond Jim Crow. And you could tell me, I'm just speculating, Ms. Mullen, that you guys are going to be in this particular part talking about how the descendants of white people have benefited and still benefit from the fruits of slavery. Is that where you guys are going? Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So we started at the beginning, talking about the 40-acre land grants. This these islands from Charleston South, abandoned rice fields along the river, 30 miles back to the sea, to the country bordering St. Johns River, Florida, some 341 miles. So by our calculation, some 1,900 square miles or 5.3 million acres in 3 states would have been available for homesteads for these, new freed women and men. So this would have, we know that 40,000 free Black people were settled on 400,000 acres of land, and then the whole thing is reversed, right? And so, and then we had the companion project of the Homestead Acts for white people. So in the 19th century, the path to middle class life was land acquisition, right? That was the way the federal government was helping Americans become middle class. And we always say, we don't begrudge these white Americans those land grants. We simply think that Black Americans also should have been availed of that free equity program.
Absolutely.
So when you come to the 20th century, the way the federal government assisted Americans in, rising up to the middle class was home ownership. So no longer land ownership, but home ownership. So how does this happen? So you have these federal programs that assist people with, getting loans, backing those loans, making sure that the houses are, the appraisal value is constant and rising for white people. But for Black people, you're talking about redlining and restricted.
Yes.
We're talking about the Fair Acts bill and the GI bill that systematically excluded Black people. One of our colleagues, Ira Katz Nelson, has written a fabulous book called When Affirmative Action Was White. In it, he looks at states across the country and who received these GI Bill supports. So this is subsidies that were made available to veterans returning from World War II. And they could be used both to help pay for your college education or training if you wanted to go to training school, and they also could be used to help purchase a new home. So the down payment on a home, and the home is backed by the federal government, these FHA loans. So you're not going to have difficulty presenting yourself at a bank if the federal government is backing your loan. But unfortunately, Black people were systematically excluded from this legislation. Ira Katz Nelson has done research on Mississippi and shows that in one period, I think it's in 1942 or 43, several thousand white GIs were able to obtain loans either for their homes or funds outright to go to college, and 2 Black people in that same time frame. So thousands of white people in this one part of Mississippi and 2 Black people. So there were all kinds. It was a federal program, but the programs were administered by the states, and so the states are making their own decisions about who's going to benefit. Well, the Southerners, the Southern legislators were not interested in giving large numbers of Black people a leg up. They liked their quality of life. They liked, having this 2-tiered system that only worked when you have, one group of people who are in a much better position economically than another. And if you can keep those people in their subjugated, space, in this role, then you can just continue, infinitely.
And to be honest with you, Ms. Mullen, I think that's why we haven't been getting, that's why we haven't received reparations. It's not that they can't give it to us. I'm of the opinion that they simply don't want to. And I think what they don't want to do is redistribute the power. See, if you redistribute the wealth, you're going to redistribute the power, because wealth produces power. And so if I now make you wealthy, now I'm going to empower you. And so they don't want, this is just Dr. Maat's opinion. I'm of the opinion that they don't want to do that. They don't want to share power, and that they do enjoy this caste system that we have here in America. But go ahead, Ms. Mullen. I think you wanted to jump in there.
You're raising an interesting point, but I think it's also useful to think about trends. So 20 years ago, only 4% of white Americans believed that reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery was a good idea. Okay? As recently as 2 years ago, that number had increased to 16. Then in June of this year, a group called Civics performed a survey that indicated that over 30% of white Americans believe that the wealth distribution should be looked at again. So the trend is moving in the right direction. Now, and that's a tremendous jump from 16 to 30.
Yes.
And and there have been several surveys that indicate that younger Americans,
that's who it is,
are, almost half of them believe that an actual program of reparations is what needs to happen. Now, whether these trends will continue in this direction, I don't know. But I don't think we have had in my lifetime a moment where these kinds of conversations have been happening in a sustained way as they are now. I mean, I remember in January of 2019, when Marianne Williamson, then a candidate for the presidency, dared to utter the R word.
Yeah, she did. She did.
I mean, politicians just, did not even invoke it, for fear of being, cast aside as unstable, unreliable.
And she was cast aside. I couldn't believe it when I was watching TV, and I was like, wow, she's on it. With the Democrats, she had Biden and Kamala and her, and this was for the Democratic nomination. And when she said it, I was said, wow, that was historical. Because that was a moment, because prior to that, I've never heard a politician get on the world stage and say yes. And then she started running down why and said, we will never be able to heal, until this happens. And I was like, wow, I was taken back by that. But please continue, Ms. Mullen.
It was very exciting. And then Julian Castro and then later Tom Steyer both advocated some type of reparations action. The latter two were not very specific about what they meant. And in fact, in Marianne Williamson's case, she actually did put a dollar figure on the program. I believe it was $500 billion.
Yes, she did.
When she, when we had a chance to talk with her, we did a town hall with her, and we said, this is really low. And I don't know if she, ever thought about raising that amount, and if so, to what level, I don't know. But it was interesting too that same month, Nancy Pelosi gave a talk on the Howard University campus, and she spoke in favor of HR 40 coming out of committee and being discussed. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that she supported reparations, but that was unprecedented. The Speaker of the House would even speak of HR 40. And to us, Nancy Pelosi was giving cover to other legislators and saying, it's all right, go ahead and put your name down as a supporter of this bill so that we can get it out of committee and at least have a conversation about it. And then in June, the House Judiciary Committee did have a public hearing to talk about HR 40. I don't know if you want to go into that.
Oh, no, we can. I mean, I know time is winding down, but you can talk about it. If you say, I know it happened in April. You said 2019, the right. HR hearing with Sheila Jackson.
Right. And so that was interesting to us because, we watched a lot, not all, but watched a lot of the proceedings on television. And my co-author, William Darity, had been invited to provide testimony, but we had another engagement. And so, but he was allowed to submit written testimony.
Okay.
Which he did do, and it's part of the congressional record, if anyone would like to look that up.
Well, Ms. Mullen, I wish he was there because I'm gonna be honest with you. The majority of the panel, in my opinion, wasn't qualified to speak on this topic. I had to put that out there. I mean, I was impressed with Dr. Julianne Marvel, Dr. Julianne. She's been on my platform. Hopefully I bring her back. She came on and they were trying to hurry up and shut her out and get her out of there. They kept cutting her off. And I know that brother Ta-Nehisi Coates, he wrote a piece called the Case for Reparations. And so he was there and giving his perspective on it. But I do wish people, like Dr. William Darity was on the panel. People like Dr. Claude Anderson. And I know some people disagree with his ideas, but I just feel like these some folks that should have been on the panel. Folks that are qualified to speak on this stuff. You should have been on a panel, Ms. Mullen. Folks who are qualified to speak on this topic. But I felt like they had a lot of Black folks on the panel that just wasn't qualified to speak.
It's a complex topic, and you need a lot of advocates. It certainly is a topic that people have strong opinions about. One of the things that we observe, though, is that the majority of the witnesses spoke to the question of reparations, for it or against it. But we don't recall anyone speaking to the actual text of H.R. 40. And I, wonder how many of them actually have read H.R. 40. The bill was introduced first in 1989 by Michigan, the late Michigan Democrat John Conyers. But, do people know that it's been revised twice? That's kind of interesting. And to what effect? And we would say not positive effect. So, we could talk at length about HR 40, but there are three things I wanted to mention that we think would strengthen HR 40 and increase the likelihood that it would result in what we think of as true reparations. So there are three features of a Black reparations plan that we believe are just absolutely essential. So the first is eligibility.
Ms. Mullen, we're on part 6?
Yes.
Yes, I was getting ready to get to that. Part 6, a program for reparations. What page, Ms. Mullen?
So hang on. All right.
I'm on page 256.
Okay.
That's the start of it.
Okay, so when you're thinking about eligibility, for us, you're talking about Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. Mm-hmm. So these are the people whose ancestors were denied those 40-acre land grants that we talked about at the very beginning. So to establish eligibility, an individual must satisfy a lineage standard and an identity standard. So at least one of their forebears was enslaved in the United States, and they must provide proof that they have self-identified as Black, African-American, Afro-American, Negro on an official document for at least 12 years prior to the enactment of either a reparations program or a reparations commission, whichever comes first. Eligibility. Okay. So next is closing the wealth gap. Okay, so we know the Black-white wealth differential is this powerful economic indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of structural racism on these living descendants of the people who were enslaved in the U.S. So compounding this initial denial of 40-acre land grants, then you've got this succeeding century, like almost 100 years of legal segregation when white terrorism prevailed. We talked about this lynching trail, everything from Coushatta, Louisiana, Elaine, Arkansas, Memphis,
yes,
Baltimore,
teach,
Chicago, Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska. There's hardly any state that has not had some Black community, especially if there was a Black business community. I often say, the part of the reason that we are aware of these Black Wall Streets is that they were destroyed. Mm-hmm. Their visibility made them targets. Like terror campaigns. Their success made them targets. Okay. So, you've got, dozens of communities, Ocoee, Florida, so it's interesting, places like Ocoee, where about 30 Black people were killed on a single day. And this was election day. Right? So these are individuals in the 1940s. These are individuals who were either, actively registering people to vote, or they were candidates themselves. And, the local, the local white people in power said, no, this is not going to happen. So, places where Black people had gained just a toehold in local politics, or managed to build commercial or residential districts, they were the targets of these violent property seizures by white mob attacks. So in the 20th century, we talked about, the shift from land ownership to home ownership and the role that the government played, systematically denying these resources that white people use to become homeowners. So the elimination of, the goal, for the reparations program, kind of keep this in our minds, is eliminating this black-white wealth differential. That's the baseline, for the size of the reparations bill. And so, we've said we estimate that baseline requirement at $10 to $12 trillion. And this is in 2016 dollars to bring the Black share of wealth at least, into proportion with the Black population in the United States. So then the next piece is direct payments, right? This is the last piece. So for both substantive and symbolic reasons, a reparations plan must include direct payments. And this can be through trust accounts, cash transfers, any number of different types of assets to these eligible recipients. People say, well, what about, earlier we were talking about these community-wide programs, or the appointment of this individual or that individual, or scholarships. But we know that these community-wide programs, don't always measure up when you have gentrification.
Yes.
You can invest a lot of money in a community, but then the taxes go up dramatically and the Black residents can't afford to stay there. They leave. And then another group, that those amenities were not intended for, reap the benefits.
Right. Absolutely.
So, this is why, giving those funds directly to individuals as opposed to communities makes a big difference. We often talk about scholarships. Education is important. I mean, I certainly believe that, it is essential for, the Black community to become as educated as possible. In fact, we're already really invested, Black people are very, very invested in becoming educated. When you look at the kind of money that Black Americans have, compared to what white Americans have, more of the money that Black Americans have is spent on education. Because this is something that it's just ingrained. It's like this is going to be the leg up.
Yes,
and it is essential, but it will not move that needle on the racial wealth gap.
But Ms. Mullen, I feel like, and I talked to my mom. My mommy's a baby boomer. She was born in 52, and my pops, he was born in 47. So those the boomers. I think that was the philosophy of the baby boomers, because the baby boomers were like the first, I would say, and I'm an 80s baby. So it seems like the baby boomers, when I've studied history, it seems like they were the first generation that education was the key. They got educated. They started getting, better jobs. So I feel like the baby boomers really pushed the education is the key. It's the key out of out of poverty, because a lot of them, they did very well once they got college degrees and master's degrees and PhDs. They went on to move into the suburbs. And so I think, and this is just my take on it, Ms. Mullen, do you think that was like a baby boomers thing, like that push for education is the key, or you don't think so?
Education absolutely can help move individuals out of poverty, but it is not going to provide them with the kind of wealth, the proportional wealth that white Americans have. But let me say this, this is not solely a baby boomer phenomena.
Okay.
Black people have been trying to get education since we were denied it in slavery. By 1910, something like 80% of Black Americans had become literate. That's huge.
Yeah, I think I've read that in Dr. Claude Anderson's book, Powernomics.
I mean,
okay, so you're saying they weren't the first generation that really pushed it.
I think, the enslaved people understood that you could be killed in some instances for having learned to read and write. Someone who could write their own pass, and steal away. Or you could write, a bill or receipt for your own purchase. So it was really, very strategic to prevent enslaved people from acquiring these skills. And I think as a result, Black people have been trying to acquire literacy
ever since.
And when you have finally these Black colleges, institutions being built, and people said, eureka, because originally, they were colleges and universities, but basically people were getting what we would think now as the equivalent of high school credentials first.
Okay.
And then going on to, and they stay even longer to get college degrees, because for the most part, these, most towns didn't have a Black high school. My father-in-law was in the mountains of Western North Carolina, and he was part of a class of 4. This is in East Flat Rock, North Carolina, a little tiny town. And they moved to the big city of Asheville that had a Black high school, and they boarded with Black families. That was the only way that they could get a high school diploma, because their school only went up to 8th grade. This was not, a rarity. This was the case across many, many, many cities in the South, that it just was not possible for Black people to acquire the same level of education as whites, because those schools had not been built. They weren't capitalized across the South. So, Black people have understood, I think, for a long time, the importance of literacy. But we do know that Black heads of household with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of household who dropped out of high school. Okay, so and people say, well, how is that possible? What kind of opportunities will you have if you dropped out of high school? You may have dropped out of high school, but your family's wealth
was perpetuated.
It's still there.
It was passed down.
It's still there. I mean, your family may have a business, and you may have dropped out of high school, but you could start at the low level, at the ground level of that family business, and potentially move right on up, or your cousin, across town. But these families have wealth.
Nepotism.
The benefits of family association.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So for best effect, these funds should be distributed directly to individuals. So, we think that this commission, the HR 40, calls for the creation of a study commission to look at America's history and to make recommendations about reparations. Should they take place, and if so, what does that look like? But we believe that this, the commission this is a sacred mission that the commission has, and that it must produce a report that guides the nation toward the adoption of an African American reparations plan that bridges the racial wealth gap. So for us, HR 40 should be revised or maybe replaced altogether if America's 155-year-old debt finally, is to be paid.
Absolutely. I'm looking in the chat, Miss Mullen, and they are loving it. Queen Mother Althea, she says, this is a great and awesome discussion. So thank you for that breakdown. Miss Mullen. So let me give it up for you one more time. Hold on. Look, that was the wrong one. That was the wrong sound effect. I wanted my fire. I gave you the ah. Oh man. So thank you so much. Miss Mullen, for coming on the platform. I appreciate you sharing your your time with us tonight, your time, your energy, and your knowledge. Family, head on over to, I would like to say, patronize your Black-owned bookstores before you run to
Yes.
run to Amazon. You know, I know people, Amazon makes it easy. You just turn on the phone, you go to the app, and you get your stuff is on your doorstep the next day. But family, if you're near a local Black, bookstore, see if they have this. And if they don't have this book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, if they don't have it, okay, see if they can order it for you. See if they can get it in, okay? Make Amazon your last result. And there's a bookstore in Baltimore called Everyone's Place, okay? It's owned by a husband and wife team, Baba Nati and Mama Tabia. Okay, they ship around the country and also around the world. So family, call Everyone's Place and say, hey, I was listening to Dr. Maat's show. I found out, I heard about this book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. I want to know if you got it. And Baba Nati, when you ask him to get a book, he gets the book for you. So family, let's support our Black independent bookstores first before you holler at Amazon for the book. This was a beautiful, Miss Mullen, I'm going to tell you. I have 3 books I have on my list right now. I have a lot of books on my list, but I'm reading Mind Control by Baba Keating. And after that, I'm reading Raising Awareness by Baba Olatunji and Baba Mku. And then after that, I'm reading From Here to Equality. So this is on my list. I'll be reading this probably in the first quarter of next year. All right. And so anyway, Ms. Mullen, do you have any last words for the listening audience before we close on out?
Just two things. We talk about this both and, approach to moving forward. And so the both and is, I would ask, that your listeners, formally lobby and petition Congress for a reparations program for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And you can do this by writing a letter, signing, creating petitions, but also, to look at your own house, right? And look inward. And by my own house, I mean it could be your family, your neighborhood, your colleagues, your book club, your bidwiz group, your artisanal beer collective. But the idea is, looking to see, who are the thought leaders that you consult when you have issues? Who are who do you hire? When there are opportunities to make a hire, who are the vendors that you elect, that you select for the work that you're doing? Do they represent the country as a whole? There's a lot that we can do. People say, well, I'm just one person. What can I do? But there's a lot that we can do to move this mission forward. But chief among them is formally lobbying your Congress, your congressional leaders, and petitioning them about reparations. But that can be done. As I said, all these different groups that you belong to can lobby. Individuals can lobby, and organizations can do so as well. And it is absolutely the case that when elected officials receive large numbers of requests from their constituents, they do pay attention. But if we, and the opposite is true as well. If you don't speak up, then they're free to, set whatever agenda, pleases them, right? That's right. Or whatever agenda that some other group, has brought to their attention. So, part of being part of the polity, of being part of the political life in this country is educating yourself about the issues. And in this case, learning about our history, learning about the country's history, and understanding how we got to here. And then, actively communicating with your legislators. They should know your name. Your legislators should know who you are, so that when you call, when you write, they recognize your issues and know what it is that you're talking about. You should not be strangers to them or them to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Miss Mullen, for coming on the platform. I gotta have you back because I could sit and just listen to you all night. I know I ain't got all night. It's almost 10 o'clock. You told me, Dr. Maat, you had me on here for an hour, and you've had me on for an hour and 50 minutes. So thank you so much, Miss Mullen, for just sharing your time, your energy, and your wisdom with us. Also, family, get from here to equality. All right, reparations for Black Americans in the 21st century. All right, authored by Dr. William Darity and Miss A. Kirsten Mullen. Thank you so much, family, for listening. Peace and the BB Fahode.
Let's combat and fight back with maltraction. The war of the minds, they want control of the masses. And Common Core, they dumb us down in the classes. Without knowledge, we can't gain access. Build with the elders, take notes and write classes. We keep whining on the block, how it's gonna stop? Let's start supporting our own, make their supply drop. We buy stocks, then we buy blocks. Cause we know the truth and we turn